Before we get into the Word today, I wanted to just share a couple of things with you. First of all, I mentioned Vacation Bible School. I'm going to encourage you to be praying throughout the whole week because it's going to be a great week. We have a wonderful time and a wonderful opportunity. It's great to see the stage all decorated, and it looks really nice, and you can see the theme that they're going to be having this year. This year is about galactic starveyors. Now, if you'll direct your attention over to this one poster over here, right by Kurt, Colossians 1:15 through 16. It's a long one. It's 2 verses this year. And this is their memory verse. So each one of the kids this week, as they memorize that and share that with one of their leaders, they get, well, I was going to say what they get, but I'm not going to tell you because some of the kids are here. So, but they get a little gift card of some type. So it's going to be really neat to see that. And so I'm going to challenge you adults, whether you're here or not for Vacation Bible School, Colossians 1:15 through 16, I want to challenge you to memorize that as well. Now, I am not guaranteeing you that I'm going to give you a gift, okay? Some of you just need to go ahead and memorize all of chapter 1, okay? Others of you just need to go ahead and memorize all of Colossians, okay? You guys are just like, what? You're crazy, Pastor. Okay, I am a little crazy. If the kids can learn that, I think you can too. All right, so I want at least those 2 verses. Learn those this week. Okay, here's another thing. Praise the Lord. You'll see it in the bulletin. We have raised the money for the sign that we're going to be putting out front. Our 30,000 goal. I just amazed at how this church is such a giving church, and I'm so thankful. In these last, I guess 6 months more or less is when we've raised the 30,000. I want you to know that we have already signed the contract for the new sign that will go out front. It's going to take a while before you see anything because it'll take about 6 weeks or so to go through permitting through the county and all that kind of stuff. So it'll take a little while, but very thankful for you as a church giving to that so we can have that. Now let me just tell you, phase 2. Remember, that was phase 1 of 2 phases. Phase 2, and we're going to go right on into that and begin to collect money for that. It is the remodel of this building right here. New carpet, new paint, new chairs, new sound booth being moved, new lighting, hopefully. All these things, we're going to be working on that. And so we'll be letting you know soon kind of what our goal is going to be on that. And then we'll be raising the money to do phase 2. But I want you to remember something, and I share this with you as your pastor all the time. We're doing this because some of this is get old and getting wear and tear, but our primary goal at Mountain View Baptist Church is to praise and glorify Jesus Christ, okay? And we do that through worship, through Bible study. But one of the other things is this church is really good about giving to missions and going on missions. And so that maintains the focus, okay? We will give because we need to kind of update some things here, but our focus continues to be missions, which, by the way, the Kenya team, those interested in going to Kenya next year, met last Sunday after church, and there were 16 people in that meeting. So we may be sending our largest group ever to go work in Kenya next year. So be praying for those who are going to be involved in that. And then I'm so glad that Aspire Church is here today. Pastor Brian is here with his team. And then not only that, but we have a team from Alabama that has come to work with Pastor Brian at Aspire Church, and Pastor Mike Holbrook and his team, and there's quite a few of you here, so I'm so thankful that you guys are here today. Welcome to the Arizona heat. It's a little different than Alabama heat. Tough time to come, exactly. But we are so glad you guys are here, and we'll be praying for them as they will be working with Aspire Church, our church plant. They do prayer walks throughout the week and looking at different things that God's doing in the life of Aspire Church. So very thankful you guys are all here. All right, it's time to get into God's Word. We're in this series, Be Strong and Courageous. We're looking at the book of Joshua, and told you we're not going to go through every chapter, but we're going through a lot of them, okay? And today we're in chapter 6. Just to remind you where we've been so far, chapter 1, week 1, was there was a new day. Moses is dead, Joshua's the new leader, and God was taking Israel into a new direction. Week 2, Rahab, she was changed by the Lord and saved by the Lord, and remember that can happen to you as well. Week 3, crossing of the Jordan, God's message to them, and then God's miracle of parting the waters and letting them cross on dry ground. Last week, week 4, we talked about spiritual readiness for battle. Remember, the Israelites, they got across the Jordan, and they're like, man, let's just go attack Jericho right now. It's time to go. And God said, no, you're not quite ready. He said there's some things you need to do to be ready spiritually before battle. And so we looked at that all last week in chapter 5. Now today we're going to be in chapter 6, bringing down the walls. Chapter 6, bringing down the walls. And here's what I shared this with the first service, and I'll share with you guys as well. This is a hard one because it is such a familiar passage. And some of you already are thinking, I remember this from Sunday school. I learned this as a little kid. And so sometimes it's hard to block that out and let God speak afresh and new to you because you're thinking back in the past and you remember the walls and all that kind of stuff. I want to challenge you, just as I had to work on that the last few weeks as well, let God speak to you through this passage today. Let Him speak to your heart, because He always has a word for us in His Word. I'm going to read almost the whole chapter. Okay, I know it's kind of long, but we need to hear the story. So listen as I read. I'm going to begin with verse 1 and read through verse 25. Now the gates of Jericho were tightly shut because of the people that were afraid of the Israelites. No one was allowed to go out or in. But the Lord said to Joshua, I have given you Jericho, its king, and all of its strong warriors. You and your fighting men should march around the town once a day for 6 days. 7 priests will walk ahead of the ark, each carrying a ram's horn. And on the 7th day, you are to march around the town 7 times with the priests blowing the horns. When you hear the priests give one long blast on the ram's horns, have all the people shout as loud as they can. Then the walls of the town will collapse, and the people can charge straight into the town. So Joshua called together the priests and said, take up the ark of the Lord's covenant and assign 7 priests to walk in front of it, each carrying a ram's horn. Then he gave the orders to the people, march around the town, and the armed men will lead the way in front of the ark of the covenant. After Joshua spoke to the people, the 7 priests with the ram's horns started marching in the presence of the Lord, blowing the horns as they marched. The ark of the Lord's covenant followed behind them. Some of the armed men marched in front of the priests with the horns, and some behind the ark, with the priests continually blowing the horns. Do not shout, do not even talk, Joshua commanded. Not a single word from any of you until I tell you to shout, and then shout. So the ark of the Lord was carried around the town once that day, and then everyone returned to spend the night in the camp. Joshua got up early the next morning, and the priests again carried the ark of the Lord. 7 priests with the ram's horns marched in front of the ark of the Lord, blowing their horns. Again, the armed men marched both in front of the priests with the horns and behind the ark of the Lord. All this time, the priests were blowing their horns. On the 2nd day, they again marched around the town once and returned to camp, and followed this pattern for 6 days. On the 7th day, the Israelites got up at dawn and marched around the town as they had done before, but this time they went around the town 7 times. The 7th time around, as the priests sounded the long blast on the horns, Joshua commanded the people, shout, for the Lord has given you this town. And Jericho and everything in it must be completely destroyed as an offering to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and the others in her house will be spared, for she protected our spies. Do not take any of the things set apart for destruction, or you yourselves will be completely destroyed, and you will bring trouble on the camp of Israel. Everything made of silver, gold, bronze, or iron is sacred to the Lord and must be brought into His treasury. When the people heard the sound of the ram's horns, they shouted as loud as they could, and suddenly the walls of Jericho collapsed, and the Israelites charged straight into the town and captured it. They completely destroyed everything in it with their swords, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, goats, donkeys. Meanwhile, Joshua said to the 2 spies, keep your promise, go to the prostitute's house and bring her out along with all of her family. And the men who had been spies went in and brought out Rahab, her father, her mother, brothers, and all the other relatives who were with her. And they moved the whole family to a safe place near the camp of Israel. Then Israelites burned the town down and everything in it. Only the things made of silver, gold, bronze, or iron were kept for the treasury of the Lord's house. And so Joshua spared Rahab, the prostitute, and her relatives who were with her in the house, because they had hidden the spies that Joshua sent into Jericho, and she lives among the Israelites to this very day. So today we're going to be talking about this very famous passage, but I want us to look at it from the perspective of victorious faith. What does it take to have victorious faith? For the Israelites to have victorious faith, they had to obey and follow God, even though some of His instructions were kind of like, really, God? We got to do that? We got to march around this town? I don't get it, God. But victorious faith is faith when you follow God, even when you don't understand what God is doing. And so as we look at it today, I want to see what happened with them and then kind of bring it to our lives as well. What does God want to say about your faith today? In fact, my question to you would be where is your faith today? Because see, everybody has faith. And your faith is in something or someone or somewhere. Everybody has faith. And you would tell me, many of you would tell me, well, my faith is in God today. And so I would challenge you with this question. Okay, and how is your faith? Is it wavering? Or is it victorious? Where is your faith today? And how strong is your faith today? Let's look at this passage. First thing we see in this idea of Joshua chapter 6 is victorious faith relies totally on God's power. Relies completely on God's power. If it's not relying on God's power, then whose power are you relying on? Yourself. And when you rely on yourself, what happens? You crash and burn pretty quickly. So you've got to learn to rely on God's power. That's the only way you're going to have victorious faith. Now here's the thing. They had a problem. What was the problem? We've seen one of these before, these problems. Jordan was a problem, crossing the Jordan. Now they have another problem. Verse 1 says that the city of Jericho was completely shut up. There was no way in and no way out. I like the way it also adds there, it was because they were afraid of the Israelites. They were afraid of, they saw what God did for them crossing the Jordan, and they're like, my goodness, if the Israelite God can do that, what is He going to do to our city? And so they're afraid, and they've got it all blocked up, and nobody's coming in or out. Now here's what's interesting. When I was a little kid and I was learning about the walls of Jericho coming down, I remember all these pictures of the walls of Jericho and all this great thing. And I imagined and I envisioned this massive, huge city with this huge, like the wall around China, the wall of China. That's what I was thinking. That's how massive I thought it was. Until I got a little older and learned that Jericho was only about 10 acres large. So, our property, this church property, is 5 acres. So double the size of our church property, and that's Jericho. That's not very big, people. Not very big at all. In fact, if you estimate it the way they do, there was only maybe 5,000 people in the whole city. Now, because it was a lot of people that lived outside the walls and neighboring little towns and villages, and they're all afraid of the Israelites right now, they've all come into the city and closed up in there. So there may have been 20,000 people in this city. Isn't that different than what we think of when we grow up learning in Sunday school? But here's the thing. This ancient city of Jericho was a very well built walled city. In fact, it had 2 different wall systems. And if you see pictures of it where they've uncovered it, it's kind of up on a hill a little ways, and there's 2 walls. The first, the outer wall, is 6 feet thick and 20 feet high. And then the inner wall is 12 feet thick and about 30 feet high. And then there's a 15-foot guarded walkway that goes between these walls. So it may have been small, but it was very well fortified. And so they had a problem. How do they conquer this town of Jericho? And I know today, as we talk about a town of Jericho, that some of you are having some Jerichos in your life. You're having some problems. You're going through some difficulties in your life. And you're thinking, how in the world am I going to conquer this problem? How do I deal with this? Well, they had a problem, but they also had a promise. The promise was in verse 2. Did you see what it says? God says to Joshua, I have given you Jericho. I've given you the king. I've given you all the wars. Wouldn't that be great? If you were a commander of an army, if you were a general and you're about to go into battle, wouldn't you want to hear words like that? I've given you. It's yours. It's yours for the taking. The battle belongs to the Lord, and the battle has already been won by the Lord. Man, I don't know about you, but I would love to hear that. You see, God wanted the people to see, as the term we use today, through their eyes of faith, that God was the one that had the power. They had to totally rely on God's power. He wanted to see that this city on their own, they couldn't conquer it. There was no way they could get through this city, these walls, these fortified walls. Even though they outnumbered them by a great number of people, this city was not going to be able to be taken unless God did it. Whatever brick wall you're facing today, you can try as much as you want with your own power, and you'll fall flat. If you will rely on the power of God, He will give you victory through that. Now, remember, we talked about this last week or a couple of weeks ago. That victory doesn't always look like we want it to look like, because God has the overall plan. And sometimes we think victory is this way, and God said, no, victory is actually this way, when you become more and more dependent on me and follow after me. I want to challenge you today, in your life, if you want victorious faith, the very first thing you're going to have to do is totally rely upon the power of God. You're going to have to give it all up. You're going to have to say, I can't do this anymore. In fact, sometimes that's where we end up, don't we? We try everything we can in our own power, in our day-to-day life. We live in our own strength. And then finally, as the phrase says, we get to the very end of our rope, and we can't hold on anymore. And we finally let go, and God's been saying, I've been waiting for you all along. I've been wanting you to let go. Because I'm here. I'm here for you. And that's what we want to see in our life. What we see in their life of the Israelites is they're thinking, we can't do this. And God says, I know you can't, but I can. We need to rely on the power of the Lord Jesus Christ. Not only that, but then victorious faith submits willingly to the plan of God. Verses 3 through 14, there's an outline basically of the plan of how they're supposed to do this. And victorious faith can only happen if we obey God's plan, if we follow through with God, what He says to do, even though we may not understand it. Right? Has there ever been a time in your life that God told you to do something and you just like, I don't understand this, God, but you knew God was telling you? And He's like, you need to do this. It's like, really, God? But I don't get it. Why don't we do it this other way? And He says, no, I want you to do it this way. Sometimes God's methods are very understandable. Oh, okay, I get that. I'll follow that. Other times, God's saying, you may not understand it, but it's part of my plan. My methods are not always your methods. My ways are not always your ways. But I have the master plan. I'm in charge of all this. And so follow me. Now think about this for a second. Put yourself today into the shoes of one of those Israelite soldiers. And they're saying, you want us to do what? I'm here to fight, not march around in circles. Really, God? Is that what you want us to do? You've got to be kidding me. I mean, they come all close, and Joshua gives the command, and here's what we're going to do, and here's how we're supposed to do it exactly this way. And they're saying, I didn't sign up for this. I've been waiting to do battle since before the Jordan, remember? Remember how they crossed the Jordan, and they wanted to go right then? They're saying, you want us to wait 7 more days? Haven't we been waiting long enough? God says, yeah, my ways are not your ways. Submit to His plan. Here's some of the things I see. Very specific instructions He gives. I mean, very detailed. Here's how they're to march. The horns are to be blowing. The priests are carrying the Ark of the Covenant. Some of the armed men go before, some behind. And all this, you march around once the first day, then the second day once. He has it all laid out. And again, I can imagine some of the warriors saying, this is crazy. This is not what we learned in military school. We learned to battle. We learned to fight. And I'm here to fight and not march. But God said it is very specific how you're supposed to do this. And see, sometimes what happens is God speaks to us and He says, I want you to do it this way. And but God, I like that way. And so we start turning and going this way, and we start doing these things, and we end up fighting the battle in our own power and our own strength. And we're fighting a battle He never intended us to fight because we didn't follow Him in the first place. God gives specific instructions. Now, today, God gives specific instructions to His followers as well. Where do we find it? Right here. That's why I tell you from time to time, I always try to remind you, read it, study it, memorize it, learn it, but more importantly, follow it. What good is it if you memorize these verses over here on the wall unless you follow them? What good is it if you memorize the whole book of Colossians or the whole Bible or the whole Pentateuch, whatever, if you don't follow it? God's instructions are not just to be read, but to be followed. I challenge you today, if you want victorious faith, you got to follow God's plan, and you'll find His plan in His instruction book. Follow His instruction book. Here's another thing, patience. God was teaching them patience. Can you imagine this? Can you imagine one of those soldiers saying, what? 7 days? We got to march around 7 days? Can't we cut that short, God? Can't we kind of like on the second day just go ahead and attack then? Why do we have to wait 7 days? This is crazy. We've already been waiting and waiting. We've waited for 40 years in the wilderness, and now you're making us wait again? Why? God's teaching them to trust Him. God is teaching them to trust in His timing, His plan, His direction. You see, have you come to the place in your life yet where you figured out that God's timetable is not your timetable? He is what the old word is long-suffering. I like that word. He's patient. He will make us wait for a long time. I mean, just a month ago, I found out I'm going to be a grandpa, I want that tomorrow. I don't want to wait 9 more months, Come on. Why do we have to wait so long, We get impatient. We want things now. Victorious faith is faith that waits patiently on God's plan. I'll say that again. Victorious faith is faith that waits patiently on God's plan. Not yours, but His. Here's another one. I love this one. Silence. Oh my goodness. Wait a minute, God. We got to march around 7 days, once every day, and then 7 times, and we can't even say anything? We've got to be quiet? We can't talk to our neighbor? This is going to get boring, God. I mean, we know how to march. We know all about that. And we can't even talk to our neighbor. Now, granted, it only probably took an hour or so for them to march around the city, and they go back to camp, and they can talk as much as they want then, right? But God's saying, while you're marching, you are marching in silence. Can you imagine those outgoing, gregarious, fun-loving, jabber-type people? This was hard. For some people, they could sit silently for hours. Others, they're like, oh my goodness, I can't say a word. They're probably mumbling under their breath already, There's a lesson here. And the lesson is for us to understand, the verse says in Psalms, be still and know that I'm God. Problem is, we get too busy talking, don't we? Even when we come to God in prayer, we get so busy talking that we don't shut up and listen to God. And He's saying, I need to talk to you. I need you to listen. I need you to hear my voice, not your own voice. And so part of this victorious faith is submitting to God's plan and being silent even when we don't want to be silent. And then He was teaching one other thing, perseverance. 7 days going around that town. And again, I can imagine some of them are saying, man, I've had it. Day 2, I'm done with this. This doesn't make sense to me. I'm not going to hike anymore around this town. I'm done. Others on day 3 or day 5, they're just, this is crazy, God. I'm done. Why are we doing useless exercise for no avail? Except for He's teaching them perseverance. He's teaching them to build their character. Perseverance does more than anything is build your character. And what He's saying is, I want your character to be like my character. I want you to understand what it means to persevere and to follow me every day of your life. Not just the days you feel like it. I love the way He's teaching them so many different things in His plan, not anybody else's plan. And then we see also that victorious faith surrenders completely to the purposes of God. God has a master plan. He has an overall purpose for your life. And you know what it is? For you to become like Him. Every day, He wants you to be more like Him. And so there's some things here. I think there's several others, but I wanted to bring out three little ones here that I think are part of what he's saying. Here's how you become more like me. First of all, there's holiness. We sang about that just a few minutes ago in one of the songs. That we're to be set apart, that we are to stay away from some things. So as they go into the town, they were told very specifically, stay away from gold, silver, iron, those things. Do not take those for yourself. You're to take those and put them in the treasury of the Lord, okay? So basically you're staying away from that. But it wasn't just them that they were supposed to stay away from. They're also supposed to stay away from the people and the animals and all those other things of that city. They were supposed to totally destroy everything. And so they were called to be set apart, to be holy. He said, I want you to stay away from all these things because I want you to be holy unto me. And there are many times in our lives that there are people and possessions that kind of lead us astray from God, don't they? And he says, I want you to stay away from them. I want you to stay holy. I want you to follow my rules and follow my pattern. My plan for your life, my purpose for your life is to be holy like I am holy. That's what he says to us. And you can't do that if you're sidetracked with other things. Now, we're going to get into this next week, so I won't talk about it today. But in chapter 7, we're going to talk about how seriously God takes sin. Because somebody messed up in this one area right here. We're going to look at that. For those of you who are reading ahead, you already know the story, but we're going to look at that next week. Somebody messed up because they didn't listen and obey what God said about staying holy. Not only holiness, but commitment. I think commitment is a very important thing here. He says, go back in and save Rahab and her family. She had kept her end of the bargain and her end of the promise. It is our time to take and keep our end of the promise as well. And you know what? They could have just said, forget it. You know, it's too hard. You know, the guys are storming through. It's going to be hard to tell them to stay away from this one house. And they could have said, you know what? It doesn't really matter. She's not an Israelite. Let's just kill them all. They could have done that. And it would have been easy to do that. Except for the fact that God specifically said, go save Rahab and her family. And there was a commitment there that they had said to her. And God wants us to learn how to keep our promises. He wants us to understand what it means to keep our... God has kept all of His promises. There's never a promise that He's ever broken. And He never will. And so we need to learn to do the same thing. We need to learn to be committed to Him and to keep our promises. You know, especially in this day and age where we live in a society today that commitment means nothing, you know. I can say something that I shouldn't say and put it on Facebook, and then tomorrow I can say I'm sorry, and that's it, and it's supposed to be all said and done. You know what I'm referring to, right? Well, I'm not going to get in there. But the reality is, we think, oh, I can always just say I'm sorry, I'm sorry. What about commitment up front to be holy? Commitment up front to follow God. Be careful with what you say and do because you are committed to Him. You're called a Christian. Then you're committed to follow Him. Holiness, commitment, obedience. Obedience. He says you got to go in and destroy it all. Don't take anything, whatever those items I told you, take it to the treasury of the Lord, but destroy everything else. And can you imagine as they're walking in, they're thinking, ooh, that looks nice. I wouldn't mind having that in my tent. You know? Can I just have this one little thing? Or can I just take this animal because I'd love to have it in my herd and I could have more sheep in my herd because of this animal? And it would be so tempting. And the idea here is that God is testing to see if they will be obedient and not even cheat just a little bit. And He does the same thing to us as well. Are we following God completely? Are we following the purposes He has for our life? So I came across, as I was studying, a pastor who had put the whole book of, or the whole chapter of 6 of Joshua into 3 phrases. And I thought, I want to give those 3 phrases to you because one day you're going to need that. You're going to need to remember these 3 phrases. Maybe you're going to be called to preach on Joshua someday, so you have an outline, all right? Right, Joe? That's right. You never know. So here are the 3 phrases. Stand in faith. They had to stand in faith. They had to realize that Jericho was impossible without God, and yet they had to realize also that God had the power to do it, and He had promised them He would do it. They had to stand in faith. But not only standing in faith, then they also had to walk in holiness. We just talked about that. They had to be holy and separate, set apart. God takes sin seriously, and they had to follow His rules, so they walk in holiness. And then after that, they run in victory. They run in victory. Stand in faith, walk in holiness, and run in victory. When you follow the Lord, He will give you victory. Here's what's interesting. The walls collapsed is what it says. And here's what's interesting is archaeologists tell us that the walls, they've uncovered them, didn't fall this way or this way. They literally just collapsed from the bottom. And it wasn't all the wall. It was a couple of specific areas, and that allowed them to just come right in and take over the town. Here's what's interesting to me is archaeology is doing nothing but confirming the Word of God, and I love that. Oh, one other thing they found also is they've been digging down in the area of Jericho. After all this, the next layer, guess what they found? Ashes. A lot of ashes. Oh, wait a minute. They burned everything, didn't they? It just confirms that God's Word is true. It confirms what God says is truth. Run in victory. When I think of running in victory, I don't know, I didn't put this in your outline, but it only dawned on me the other day, wow, that reminds me of a passage in the New Testament. Ephesians chapter 6, beginning with verse 10. Paul says, "Be strong in the Lord and in His mighty power. Put on the whole armor of God that you will be able to stand against the enemy, the strategies of the devil. For we're not fighting against flesh and blood, but against principalities and authorities of worldly places." And he goes on and says, "Therefore put on every piece of God's armor so that you'll be able to resist the enemy in the time of evil." You want victorious faith? You got to put on the armor of God. You want victorious faith? You cannot do it on your own and in your own strength, but only through the power of the Lord Jesus Christ. You see, the Israelites, they were victorious because they had faith and obedience. In fact, if you go to the great passage in Hebrews chapter 11 of the Hall of Fame, or the Hall of Faith, then you'll see in verse 30 it says this, "It was by faith that the people of Israel marched around Jericho for 7 days, and the walls came crashing down." That's victorious faith. And by the way, that faith can be yours also. But it takes faithfulness and obedience. So I always end with this. So be what? Strong and courageous unto the Lord. Will you pray with me this morning?